Okay, well, greetings everyone. This is the latest webinar in this book project on evolution and contextual behavioral science, a reunification, which pairs evolutionists and contextual behavioral scientists on a number of topics. And so today we're really pleased to have Bruce Ellis as our evolutionist, and Joe Ciarrochi and Louise Hayes as our contextual behavioral scientists on the topic of risky adolescent behavior. Is that right?
Indeed.
Okay, good. I do a lot of these. So I want to begin by, first of all, asking each of our distinguished scientists to introduce themselves. And then we'll have a brief summary of the two chapters. And then we'll spend the rest of the time in a free-ranging discussion. So, Bruce, why don't we begin with you?
Sure. I'm an evolutionary developmental psychologist. I'm a professor at the University of Utah in psychology and anthropology. My main research interest is in developmental programming. And that is, I am interested in how the developing child, particularly, uses information in their environment. What is it that they pay attention to? What is important in terms of the environment, and how does the developing person, use that information to choose different developmental trajectories, such as slow versus fast life history strategies. Right. So, all of my work touches on that large issue of some level.
Awesome. Great. Okay. Louise.
Thanks, David. Hi, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm also an ACT and contextual behavioural science peer-reviewed trainer. So I spend a lot of my time working in the clinic directly with adolescents and their families, but also working in training, professional development. And I'm also a research fellow with the University of Melbourne, and I look at treatment development for young people, and particularly young people who are struggling.
Awesome. Great. Okay. Joe.
Yes, I'm a professor at the Institute of Positive Psychology and Education here at Australian Catholic University. I'm a developmental psychologist. I do a lot of research on how to help young people develop and reach their full potential. With Louise Hayes, we've got a number of books on adolescent development, such as The Thriving Adolescent and Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life Teens. So those are kind of our practical expression of what we think will help young people to develop well.
Awesome. Okay, so this is a great topic, and to be approached from both of these two perspectives. So, Bruce, could you please summarize the chapter, which I know well because it's based on a long review article that itself was based on a workshop that we organized together way back.
Right.
Take it away and summarize this great chapter of yours.
Thank you. So this chapter focuses on the evolutionary basis of risky adolescent behavior, and it particularly has a focus on policy and intervention questions. Now, as a life history person, and as an evolutionary life history person, we tend to have a particular view of adolescence because we think of adolescence as a transition point in the life course, and particularly adolescence and puberty itself is a transition from the pre-reproductive to the reproductive phase of the human lifespan. And that is a critical functional transition, because when an organism transitions to the reproductive phase of its lifespan, it has to actually break into the breeding pool. It has to attain the status and the resources and the competency to actually compete for mates, gain mates, protect mates. And this is, from an evolutionary perspective, why the transition to adolescence, why adolescents become so focused on certain things like status and social centrality and social acceptance and physical attractiveness and all types of factors that are critical to developing social relationships, protecting social relationships, and attracting mates. One of the key features of adolescence, particularly from an evolutionary perspective, but pretty much anyone studying adolescence notices that this is a period of time when there is a marked increase in morbidity and also mortality resulting from risky behaviors in terms of injuries and death from things like, from fighting, from engaging in risky sports, from competing with other mates, from substance use, from risky sexual behavior. All these things this is kind of a dramatic a pivot point, a time where these things change in terms of their frequency and trajectory. And adolescence, there's a reason why they're changing at this period, because adolescence is really an inflection point in the development of status. That where individuals get during adolescence tends to have a long-term effect on their trajectories and their life outcomes. One interesting example of that, it's well known, for instance, that men who are taller tend to have higher incomes in adulthood. However, it's not final adult height that predicts income. It's actually the height that you achieved during adolescence. For those who actually were late bloomers and got tall, late in adolescence, it doesn't really help to be tall. So presumably, it's gaining height during adolescence that's important, because it is giving you an advantage in adolescent dominance hierarchies. So in thinking about risky adolescent behavior, evolutionists tend to think a lot about the costs and benefits, but they think about this kind of in a different way than from a standard public health model. So when we think about risks, from an evolutionary perspective, risk is really defined in terms of the level of variation in outcomes. So risks have a high chance of failure and a high chance of success, or more, just a wider range of outcomes. And individuals that are trying to gain status or break into the breeding pool, who may be starting out in a disadvantaged position or in a position where the odds are relatively long, low risk behaviors that really minimize variation in outcomes won't do them much good. This is really a context that favors higher risk behaviors where you might actually really change something. Now, of course, not all adolescents engage in risky behavior. This is just a general trend, a central tendency towards more risky status seeking. But a lot of this depends on the types of environments that you're in and the types of resources that you have, and the strategies that you employ will depend very much on the level of threat versus danger, as opposed to the levels of support and nurturance in your environment, and that will tend to send individuals down very different strategies. So from this perspective, growing up under stressful conditions does not so much disrupt or impair development as direct or regulate it towards strategies that are adaptive under stressful conditions, which in adolescence may include high-risk strategies, although that might be less the case for individuals who come from more stable backgrounds. I think if I was just going to say what was the most important message of the chapter, and really thinking about adolescence from an evolutionary perspective, it's just thinking about, in terms of any kind of intervention or any kind of behavioral strategy you're trying to do with adolescents, you have to start with the question, what's in it for the adolescent? What is the underlying motive that's driving their behavior? What is important? Any kind of intervention that attempts to work against rather than with adolescent goals and motivations is just going to be, in my opinion, doomed to fail, or at least fighting a very steep uphill battle. So we think about, what is important to adolescents, what are they trying to gain? And in thinking about interventions, such as the meaningful roles intervention, which is an intervention that I've developed based on an evolutionary perspective, it's very much trying to recognize and work with those goals and motivations.
Great, awesome. Okay, well, Louise and Joe, I don't know how you want to divide labor, but give us a summary of your chapter.
We agree with everything Bruce is saying. I think that's an awesome chapter you wrote, Bruce, and really kind of helps us to ground things in evolutionary science, and I think really works with young people. Our chapter is based on our model DNAV, which is an expression of contextual-based behavioral science. So anytime I talk about our model, I'm really talking about contextual behavioral science. And what contextual behavioral science is a kind of revolution against the tyranny of a metaphor that dominates psychology, has dominated for many decades. And it's the tyranny of the mind-machine metaphor, which goes something like this. If a kid is struggling, you have to look inside their mind machine and fix something inside them. So they need, maybe they have bad impulses, you need to sort that out, or they lack confidence, or they're not mindful enough. So the focus is always on finding something inside the young person that is kind of wrong and fixing it. So DNA V and CBS is a kind of rebellion against this. So let me start with the V part of the model, which stands for values or vital activity. So everything in our model is in the service of V, of vital activity. And the key thing about this activity, the way we see it, is it can't be defined independently of context. So vital activity is about the person in context. So just as you can't tell, a plant does not grow vigorously with independent of sun and soil. And we see the same thing with youth. We don't expect to understand how to help a young person grow just by looking inside their heads. Ultimately,
actually, Joel, let me just, I wanted to jump in on a specific point about the V and the fact that it's two V's. It's valued action and vitality. Yeah. And why do you need two V's? What are you capturing with those two words?
Well, that's an interesting question. Louise and I worked really hard on thinking about that. And one of our concerns was that values tend to be fairly verbal. And so we felt like vital activity captures a bit more of that sense of thriving that could be nonverbal, which is especially important for young people. Would that be right, Louise? Is that?
Yeah, I agree. And it also captures the early development of a young person. For children, for example, might not have what we would define in contextual behavioural science as valued action, but they're certainly seeking vitality, and that's in a different developmental sequence or a different developmental trajectory than an adult who have I care about this kind of valued behaviour.
Okay, good.
So let me just talk about this, how this contextual behavior science thing rebels against tyranny of the mind machine. And so the main thing in this model is that the selection criteria is value. And this is values or vital activity are assumed to promote survival. So this is the connection to evolutionary science. Things are selected for based on this V. Now, just to give you a very quick rundown of the model, A in DNA V stands for advisor. It's just like our inner voice, links to beliefs, thoughts. And a lot of approaches to youth see certain thoughts as inherently good and other thoughts as inherently bad. So I am worthless is bad and has to be fixed. A thought like I am worthless is bad. Thinking positively is assumed to be good. Thinking like an adult is assumed to be good. But within a contextual behavior science model, no type of thinking is inherently good or bad. It's all going to depend on context and how it helps the young person to kind of do well in that context. I am worthless might be a thought connected to reconnecting with your tribe, for example. Thinking positively could be connected to a kid being unrealistic and making big mistakes and not taking feedback. So thinking like an adult may be totally inappropriate for the young person. You know what I mean? So it's about that there's no magical thought, no magical pill. And Louise and I see this as a dominant problem in our society, the way that people think that some sorts of thinking is inherently good or bad. So contextual behavior science puts thinking into context in the same way that you would put any adaptation into context.
And this is a point of convergence with what Bruce said, basically, the developmental psychopathology model. I think there is a case where you're very much on the same page.
Yes, definitely. And, you know, the typical way that things are approached in psychology is we look at clinical samples and we say, well, those people tend to think the thought, I'm worthless a lot. And normal people don't think that thought. So what we need to do is make the clinical people more like normal people. And then that gets applied to kids. And kids are on their own trip, so it doesn't really work very well. We don't think anyway. You got to look at how they're navigating their context, which isn't the adult context, which is their own. They're in their own world, and a lot of times they're by themselves, having to kind of solve problems that are hard. And a lot of the adult solutions don't work. So N stands for noticer, and the closest word in pop psychology for noticer is probably mindfulness. And again, we rebel against this. There's an idea that mindfulness is inherently good, that it's like a pill we need to give to every student, every school. It's just an inherently good thing. And we rebel against that. Again, I mean, mindfulness, and there's starting to be research showing that mindfulness interventions may be counterindicated sometimes. Sometimes it may not be a good idea to kind of help a kid connect with emotions in a certain way if they're not prepared to do that, you know, in the case of trauma, for example. again, noticing and mindfulness isn't an inherent good. It is in the service of promoting valued action. It's just one space in the DNAV model that people can move to, call it noticer space. And it's in the service of values. It's not inherently good or bad. You move to other spaces when it works or doesn't work. Finally, D, the last part of the model, stands for discoverer and doer. And this really does link to Bruce's model quite well. Where the advisor is our inner voice, it's about helping us to avoid trial and error learning. The discoverer or doer is about trial and error learning. So from the mind-machine metaphor, certain impulses in adolescence, like to take risks, are inherently bad. But we really like Bruce's approach of showing that those can be adaptive and essential to positive development. Once again, DNAV does not define impulses, risk-taking impulses, as inherently good or bad. They're actually needed a lot of times to engage in this risky trial and error behavior so that the young person can build their social networks, develop their skills. They need to make mistakes. They need to take chances. So hope that kind of summarizes DNAV in a very quick way. But the point is that no content is inherently good or bad. And we've kind of provided a framework that seeks to unify a lot of different threads in contextual behavior science into this simple model.
Awesome, great. Louise.
Okay, I get the contextual piece. So what Joe described is the four processes that we talk about, DNA and V, are really four kind of groups of behaviour that we've put together from the research that pretty much cover everything a teenager does, everything an adolescent does, or everything a human does, really. And we began looking from early development in childhood to layer up and consider, how does development happen? So rather than take a top-down approach and look at what adults do, which is common in applied therapeutic work or applied work with young people, as we take what we do with adults and we try to make the language simpler. So we began from the other way and thought about the developmental trajectories and how do people begin. And Bruce, your chapter is great because it fits perfectly with the work that we've been doing of development in context and how a human adapts and develops within a context. And so the two pieces that Joe didn't mention that I'm going to mention outside of those four key processes of behaviour, and we think of them not as techniques but processes, that we can look at how a human has adapted this particular kind of behavioural process, such as being a noticer. We look at two different perspectives, two contextual perspectives. One is the perspective of their social world, and the other one is the perspective of developing a self, becoming a self. So I'll begin, because we're talking about young people, if we begin with a social context, we look at how your behavioural processes of becoming a noticer, being born in the world, able to notice what goes on inside you and what goes on outside you, and ready to protect yourself and detect danger. Developing the language skill that we call the advisor, being able to navigate the world through using words and language, and the discoverer from early ages being able to push things and poke things and stand up and walk and fall down. We look at how those three kinds of behaviour and the seeking of vitality, how those four kinds of behaviour account vitality, how those four processes are developed within the context of the social world. So from a young person, we begin with attachment processes, and we really embed a deep inside work of attachment, beginning from Bowlby and all of the decades of research we have on attachment and the social world and how that influences adaptation. So we look at how they help a young person develop these behavioural processes, and then we also look at the reciprocity of how, as a young person grows and becomes, for example, adolescence, the topic of this conversation, how that by then they begin to influence their social world back. So they use their discoverer, noticer, advisor and vitality seeking and influence their social world in return. So we look at that as a reciprocal context, a perspective, a way of seeing how a young person is developing skills, and also not just seeing and assessing how they're developing, but influencing them and using interventions to influence them. And the social context is very similar, except that it's all about what's going on inside the individual. So we see the development of the self, and this is particularly, of course, an adolescent task, that the development of the self comes from not defining the self as a thing, but seeing the self as behaviours that we engage in. So as I grow and I learn how to notice my feelings or notice what's going on outside me and notice how people respond to me, and as I discover and take risks and try things, I also develop a language around who I am and what kind of a person I am in my context. Am I a smart person? Am I a popular person? And that influences the self that I become. And self is a behaviour is saying, I am a smart person, I am a dumb person. And that is just like the social context becomes a reciprocal influence that influences how a young person grows. And so we look at these two perspectives, the self perspective and the social perspective, and how they influence the shaping of discoverer, noticer, advisor, and values behaviours. We do that at an assessment level and then at an intervention level. So we consider it, it's kind of a holistic, one of the good things about contextual behavioural science is you get this nice holistic way of looking at what's going on within the individual, selection by consequences inside them for verbal behaviour and overt behaviour, and also outside the individual between other individuals, so within and between as a holistic way of looking at it.
Awesome. Okay, well, that is great. So much to think about. And let me get the ball rolling for the open discussion with a few observations about both chapters. They're very strikingly similar, I think, in their emphasis on behavior and context. So that's one thing that they share in common. Bruce says, you know, what's in it for the kids, basically. Almost everything that we consider pathological is, in fact, adaptive in the evolutionary sense of the word. And so that's a rather subtle but essential point to make about evolutionary thinking in general. And then you two made exactly the same point for behavior and context. That's like the essence of contextual behavioral science and why it is that they're both evolutionary and both have evolutionary roots. Yet at the same time, there is some very striking differences between the chapters, and not just between this pair of chapters, but the other pairs of chapters in the book. And to explain that, let me digress just a little bit and say that I've written that the human behavioral system should be thought of as like the immune system, with an adaptive component and an innate component. So the innate component would be modules, basically a psychological architecture and a whole physiological architecture that evolved by genetic evolution, and would be much the same in humans as in other mammals and other vertebrates. You could also call this closed phenotypic plasticity. And then the adaptive component would be more open-ended, and it would be represented by Skinnerian processes, such things as operant conditioning, and also language, and what's studied in CBS with the relational frame theory and the like, a big emphasis on symbolic thought. Now, these things do go together, and authors such as Jablonka and Lamb in their book Evolution in Four Dimensions is a giant step towards putting them together. But looking at the chapters, then I think I see Bruce's chapter as being largely about the innate component of the behavioral system, much like other mammals, and Joe and Louise's chapter as concentrated on the adaptive component of the behavioral system, have much to do with selection by consequences, and then its extensions into symbolic thought and language, which not very much overlap between the two chapters there. So based on that long reflection, I wonder if you could just comment on that, and maybe we could take a step or two in unifying the two chapters in that respect. Anyone is welcome to start.
Well, I can jump in. So I shared your observation that there were similarities and also, quite distinct differences. And I am kind of in a learning process, in terms of CBS and its implications. So I am not necessarily, well positioned to comment on that in detail. I would just like to say that, to kind of paraphrase something that E.O. Wilson once said. E.O. Wilson said that what evolves is the directedness of learning. And that is the relative ease with which certain associations are made and others are bypassed, even in the face of relatively strong reinforcement. So it's not so much that I don't think of it so much as having an innate component and having a learned component, but I think of that kind of consistent with that quote from E.O. Wilson, that what evolves is certain directedness or preparedness of learning. So we tend to take in some information or pay attention to some information much more easily and much more readily than others. And that can be, and so if you start thinking about how contexts affect adolescence, of course, you're not starting with a blank slate in any means. You have certain types of information and certain contexts that are going to be extremely important to adolescents because they are at a particular life phase where they are trying to transition to a reproductive phase of a lifespan where they have to actually successfully mate, where they have to actually successfully attract partners. And so there's going to be lots of contingencies in the environment that are going to be really important to them. You can let things like social inclusion, social centrality, relative status, relative position. These things are hugely influential in adolescence. So thinking about how the social context and how symbolic contexts and how social media and how all these things operate, it's going to be in a dramatically non-arbitrary way.
Sure. Well, that's part of the ecology of the adolescent that you were talking about there, right?
Yeah, it's the ecology of the adolescent, but yes, the ecology of the adolescent, and just what you can just ask what is it in the environment that's important? What do they pay attention to? What actually evokes biological responses? What actually gets under the skin? And so I think that gives you a real connection point between an evolutionary perspective and any kind of contextual analysis that wants to change behavior, because behavior is in context, is unfolding in such a, in my opinion, non-arbitrary way.
Right. And so, Joe and Louise, go ahead.
Can I jump in?
Yeah. Sure, go ahead, Louise.
And then you can follow me if you want to.
Sure.
Thank you, Bruce. And I agree that there are lots of similarities and some big differences. And I'd like to just talk about context as one of those things. We've spent a lot of time talking about context and behaviour in context, and Bruce is looking at. So from a contextual behavioural science perspective, context is not only the physical environment, but it also brings this new piece of the verbal environment becomes a context. And adolescence is, of course, that explosion of language and cognition and verbal behaviour and the ability to begin to look outside your family and to understand your world and where you fit in. And relational frame theory allows us to understand that verbal context as a behaviour that is that we can understand from the arbitrarily applicable relational responding piece, which is a verbal operant, and help us look at how that is selected by consequences inside the individual. So context is not just the physical environment, but also the verbal environment and how that evolves and develops. And we can see, and we can begin to look at how a young person is shaping their own world by their memories, their history, how they use time, and how they use interactions. And that really gives us an opportunity that we didn't have before. So it's really changed how we can see it. So I think it allows us to layer on to the decades that we have of selection by consequences in operant behaviour, decades of research showing how children's behaviour can be adapted and changed by selection of those consequences, and allows us to get inside that symbolic verbal realm where people's worth can be determined by what they think. Or what other people
I want to acknowledge for the whole volume that there's something very constructivist about CBS and relational frame theory. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So, I think there's a baby in the bathwater of constructivism. And there's a baby in the bathwater in kind of the innateism that we think of as at least some schools of evolutionary psychology. And the challenge is to find, to keep the babies and throw out the bathwater. So is one way to put it. So Joe, please.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why you see it's a difference in emphasis because we accept everything Bruce says, but one focus of contextual behavior science is on the changeable aspects of the environment and how we can get a handle on those things to improve the condition of young people. And just to give you an example of how the two maybe link up, the innate and the kind of environment. Certainly we recognize that how sensitive adolescents are to social evaluation and to relative status. And they're very sensitive to threats to social evaluation, threats to status. So from an evolutionary perspective, Louise was just talking about language. One of the functions of language, one of the reasons why we have it is that it's helped us to avoid trial and error learning. If I tell Louise, don't go by that bush, there's a snake there, she doesn't actually have to experience the snake to avoid death, or she doesn't have to be at risk. So language has evolved as this way of avoiding trial and error learning. And so let me show you where that comes in practically with young people. So when in this modern culture, when a kid has a negative thought like, I am unloved or I am worthless, one of the first things people do is to, adults often challenge that and say, no, but you're a wonderful person. You're great. You're lovely. And what we find again and again is that when people challenge those thoughts, a lot of times the young person will resist it and fight back. They will actually defend the negative belief, the negative thought. And that's kind of weird. Shouldn't everybody just want these positive thoughts, these confidence, unlock the giant within kind of stuff? And well, it turns out that if you start to look at it functionally, language is there to keep us safe. And so when a young person thinks something like, I'm no good at math, then that verbal statement is there to protect them from embarrassing themselves, making mistakes, losing social status in math. As long as they listen to that belief, they can avoid situations like that. So the reason they resist is because you're basically asking them to do something that makes them feel quite unsafe. And so I think that comes from a better understanding of how language has evolved to help us avoid trial and error learning. And so when you seek to challenge so-called negative beliefs of young people, you're also challenging their sense of safety and security. Those beliefs, however negative, often provide them with security.
Yeah. Bruce, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah. So, thinking about this, this issue of resistance and the example you gave about where adolescents may have a self-perception, a negative self-perception, and an adult may try to change that and they encounter resistance. I mean, in general, there's one of the species typical changes that occurs in adolescence is that, and this is just something that any parent of an adolescent will have observed, is that adolescents become more resistant to parental advice and information. As one writer once said, I'm sorry, I can't quote who said this, but in adolescence, you have to, you get fired as your child's manager, and you have to do everything you can to try to get rehired as their consultant. Which is
a nice one, yeah.
A nice way of thinking about this. So this is, so there's this issue, and I think this becomes very relevant to thinking about interventions with adolescents. Is that adolescents can't? It's in any kind of intervention you develop, you do not want adolescents to feel that they're being manipulated or stigmatized. And so it is very, the challenge with many interventions around adolescence is that most interventions single out adolescents. So if you're in a school context and you have someone who's been identified as having behavioral problems or someone who's failing in their classes, they may get put in a special class, they may get targeted for an anti-bullying intervention, they may get more. And as soon as you pick an adolescent out and you target them for an adult-driven intervention, you've almost lost before you've begun, because because adolescents don't want to be managed in that way. And so it's very, that presents challenges. And I've actually thought about this in develop and actually working in working with adolescents to develop interventions. So in the for example, in the intervention which I've developed, it's called.
Talk more about that. Your meaningful roles intervention. Let's hear some more about that.
Yeah. So let me just kind of mention a little bit about the meaningful roles intervention and how it tries to get around that problem. So meaningful roles was developed as an anti-bullying intervention. It's something I developed in collaboration with Dennis Embry and also Anthony Volk and Jose Michael Gonzalez. And it's recently published a first paper of this showing initial results. And in this intervention, what it does is that it's designed as a school-wide anti-bullying intervention. And in this intervention, the basic what you basically try and do is you go into a school and it's a jobs program. And every kid in the school actually gets a job to do that has some important role in running the school. But before you go in, you actually collect data in the school about who is engaging in more antisocial or bullying behaviors. And the interventionists themselves, maybe in collaboration with one carefully chosen administrator, kind of finds out kind of who the kids are that are engaging in bullying behavior. It's typically brought in when there's a bullying problem. And then everyone gets a job, but they get targeted for particular jobs. They don't know they've been targeted because everyone gets a job, but they get kind of put into jobs that give them an alternative prosocial way to obtain status. So, in the one school that we did this, bullying was often taking place, in the bathrooms, in between when classes were changing, kids were getting beat up. And so we identified who those kids were, and we gave them a job which was called the door greeter. And they got to get out of class a little bit early, and they got to use the bathroom, have it all to themselves when no one else was there. And then by the time the bell rang, they would position themselves at the next classroom, and their job would be to greet other kids coming in. They'd say like, hello, welcome to Mr. Smith's, 8th grade biology class. And they would greet people, would come in, and they would be doing, and it gave them a way to obtain social centrality and recognition in a pro-social way. And it actually, like the door greeter became a very popular role, and the bullies would be there doing it, and the assistants would line up behind them. They'd have a whole greeting line. But in this, one reason why we think this is different than other anti-bullying interventions and may account for why we have some success with it is that nobody actually knows they're being targeted by the intervention. The intervention doesn't pick anyone out and separate them in any other way. It just gives everyone a job, but you as the interventionists are very strategic about what kind of jobs they're getting. And it's basically putting kids that have a history of obtaining status and social centrality through antisocial means. It's giving them a way to achieve those same goals through prosocial means. And that is, and when you think about how to address, for example, problem behaviors or kids that are, particularly, victimizing other kids, when you actually study bullying, you find out that bullying is a very effective method to obtain a lot of things that adolescents care about. Adolescents use bullying to leverage social centrality. Bullies start dating at a younger age. Bullies are actually, quite more connected to social networks. They often control more territory. They gain resources. A lot of things you get from it. So an intervention, the typical intervention, which is zero tolerance, which just tells kids stop bullying now and inflicts punishments to stop bullying, it doesn't work at all, because why would kids give up a very effective strategy with nothing in return? They just won't, and they don't. So you have to think very much about how to get them an alternative way of achieving those same goals. And so, coming back to an evolutionary perspective, it's really about, starting with the question, what is the function of this behavior in adolescents' lives? How are adolescents, using this behavior to achieve goals that are important at this stage of the lifespan, are important to adolescence? And then you have to figure out ways to actually work with it rather than against it. And it's just kind of remarkable to me when you actually look at prevalent interventions, how common it is to use punishment to stigmatize kids, to target kids, and to try to use coercive methods to, for instance, stop bullying, which often are iatrogenic or have effects that are just the opposite of what's intended.
Yeah, and I should note that, I mean, as part of CBS, or the whole contextual approach of both evolution and CBS, that you can try to change the behavior, or you can try to change the environment, the context. And maybe the most effective thing to do is change the context. And when you do, then the behavior changes because individuals just adapt to the new context. So you actually didn't have to work on them. You had to work on the context. And that would be an example. So, Joe and Louise, what do you think of that program? Is it similar to what you do, or?
Yeah, that sounds very much. Just to note, I totally agree with everything Bruce says. That sounds like an amazing program, Bruce. I'd love to get the paper. Louise and I have been doing something similar where we empower young people to kind of be the leaders in their own community and to change their own community. But one thing I just wanted to note was that when we work with young people, the whole model in contextual-based science is driven by their values, their needs, their vitality. So we begin first, we need to know, what they need in that context. So I think that's really critical. Would you agree, Louise?
Excuse me. Yep, I would absolutely agree. And I think the thing that, I know I said it earlier, but I think it's important to continually return back to is when we talk about changing their context, we can also talk about changing their verbal context. So it can be the context within them. Yep. So Bruce, your intervention would, I imagine, be, we'd have to measure it, of course, but I would imagine that your intervention is changing the verbal context inside the bully, so that it's giving them more variation in how they see themselves and how they understand themselves. So I think that we need to think both within the individual as a context inside there too. And that's what Joe and I have been trying to do by working on all of those levels when we change context.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the idea is, like, I love your approach, Bruce. I really would like to see if Louise and I can combine with what we do, because, a lot of way adolescents are viewed as, you kind of put them in school and you house them there for 4 or 5 years till they're ready to do something in the real world. But they're not quite ready yet. And why not, instead of thinking of them as just being stored in school till they're ready, think of them as potentially being able to be the force of change now. Why can't they be the leaders now in their own community? They live inside that community. They grow inside that community. So I love your approach of kind of looking at their needs first and kind of empowering them to get their needs met in a way that is positive for the whole group.
Right. The intervention does very much try to empower adolescents, because it tries to shift them away from a mode of just being more or less passive vassals at school where they're following a program, into a mode where every one of them has a meaningful job that is important to actually running the school. So in those jobs, some of them are the gardeners, or they're actually, tending plants. Other ones are taking care of animals. If the school has animals, other ones, there's a sign painter, there's a PA announcer. And so part of the idea of this intervention is when everyone is doing something to actually help the school run, it improves the learning environment for everyone.
That's fabulous.
Let me ask a couple more questions. I have my own experience in the school for at-risk students that we created in Binghamton, which worked very well. And there were two big questions when we were starting it. There was no way of knowing. One was, these kids had had very hard lives up to the present moment, okay? And so one question is, based on attachment theory, if your environment was harsh at an early age, is there some sense in which you become committed to a strategy, a fast life history strategy, or an insecure attachment style, whatever you call it? Basically, you adapt to a harsh environment at a young age. How flexible are you, say, when you're a teenager? That's one point. And the second point was, if you manage to change the context in school, but not for the rest of the students' lives, so now you have a nice, supportive, nurturing environment in school, but the rest of their lives is as hard as ever, can you change contextually that way? And the results of our study showed that actually there was an impressive degree of flexibility in these kids, and they could actually adapt to the school environment, despite the fact that we couldn't change their other environment. But I just wonder how that conforms to the whole body of scientific literature about basically how does phenotypic plasticity change over the course of the life cycle, and if you make things better in one context, can people respond to that context even though the rest of their lives remains harsh?
Yeah. David, could I just ask you to elaborate on one thing regarding your intervention?
Yeah.
You said that you found evidence that they could actually change their behavior at school. Were you also able to find out whether they also extended this to their behavior at home, even though your intervention was not targeting home?
We did get an effect. Home became more supportive in addition to school. So yeah, there was a carryover effect, even though we couldn't directly influence that. I mean, we would do such things as call the parents and tell them how wonderful their kids were doing and things like that. So there were those natural connections.
Yeah. One of the things that you raised, really interesting point, David, like the multiple levels of groups. And a lot of times I do feel like we can change their school environment, and Bruce's program is an example of that. Maybe the home environment, but there's a sense in which some of these poor kids, disadvantaged kids, still are within one niche and aren't willing to go to another one. For example, go to university. They just don't consider that's not a life for me. So they might adapt incredibly well in their part of town and and have a happy life, all that stuff. But there seems to be like levels of groups. And I sometimes wonder that higher level, almost like the willingness to kind of go to university and be a lawyer or a doctor or something like that. But then if they go to university, their social needs, people similar to them, there's people that aren't similar to them, and it's different and it's dangerous and it's risky. I wonder sometimes how we can scale up these interventions to the higher level groups.
Yeah, there's a great study on that shows just in a nutshell that if you take minority kids when they enter college and you increase their sense of belonging, which you can do. This particular study was a 1-hour intervention that succeeded in doing that. And it halved the minority deficit in college. Just to get, and this gets back to relational frame theory and the internal environment, basically, just by instilling that belief that they belong, lasted the whole 1 hour is all it took, and it lasted all 4 years of college.
Yeah. But if you think about, David, think about this, a kind of Muslim kid from a very specific community, like the major evolutionary goals, right? An adolescent becoming an adult is to find a mate, to succeed within a community, build a community. And they're looking at this university, say, where there's nobody that looks like them, nobody that dresses like them. It's so different. Can we really say it's the most adaptive thing for that young person is to go to that university? Do you see what I mean? Like if we start to take Bruce's approach, the default response is, yeah, we want every kid to go to university, but you see the problem is deeper when you start to look at it from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah.
So just if I could jump in, just coming back to David's question about these kids that are developmentally programmed for a harsh, unpredictable environment, and then you get them into a school environment where you're trying to see if you can change them in a sense to fit a different context. And that's an issue that I've thought about a lot, that I struggle with literally every day in thinking about how to do this work. So from a life history perspective, what you have is that you have, kids that have grown up in dangerous, unpredictable environments, their contexts, their daily life experiences have induced in them an understanding that life is short, that the future is uncertain, and that you better get what you can now because you don't know what tomorrow will hold. And that shifts individuals towards certain patterns of behavior, certain patterns of cognition that are adaptive in a dangerous, unpredictable environment. Then you want to bring them into school. So first off, you have a philosophical and ethical question. And that is, do we want to change these kids to think, act, and feel more like kids from stable middle-class backgrounds? And when we take the position that we want to fix them, we are inherently assuming that these kids are broken and need to be fixed.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have to. So I think one has to be really conscious about what you're doing. Now, if you are taking that view that you want to change these kids, that they are in some sense broken, or maybe not broken but mismatched, and you want to change them, then you have to change their context. You have to change their experiences in a way that induces in them, through their everyday experiences, induces an understanding that they can live longer, healthier, more predictable lives. And if you can change the context in that way, that, what should shift is, what should follow is the actual shift in their orientation, in their cognition, and in their beliefs in a way that would lend to more, say, success in the school context. And I think that a lot of what David's school intervention is trying to do is trying to shift them, is trying to lead them to be able to trust their teachers more. I mean, when these kids come into school, they're often like a cat with its claws extended. They don't trust the teacher. They have an insecure attachment style. They have a hostile attribution bias. They may have an exploitive interpersonal style. And a lot of interventions are just trying to change all that, again, to get them to think, feel, and act more like kids from stable backgrounds. Now, there is actually an alternative. There's another way that you can think about intervention. And this alternative, and this is actually the main focus of my current work right now. And I actually lead a research network that's funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that is called, the research network is Childhood Adaptations to Stress. And this area of work asks the question, what are kids from harsh and unpredictable environments actually good at? What social and cognitive skills do you need to develop when you're growing up under adversity? What kinds of things do you need to become good at remembering? What kinds of problems do you become good at solving? What kinds of things do you become good at paying attention to? And then if we can actually study that, if we can uncover a map of what these social and cognitive skills are, then we could potentially redesign educational context and employment context in a way that would work with those skills rather than against them. So rather than trying to change these kids to more fit a middle class mode, another possibility would be to try to understand the skills and abilities that they have and to actually leverage them to enhance learning and development. And just to kind of give one concrete example, recent research suggests that kids from high adversity backgrounds, even though they're disadvantaged at sustaining attention, they're actually advantaged at shifting attention. They show some ability to unstick their attention from one thing and actually focus on something else, to change back and forth. And particularly in stressful contexts, they do that more fluidly than kids from low-risk backgrounds. Well, you could take any context, you could take anything. So for instance, the way that classrooms are set up right now, they're really designed to work with kids from safe, stable backgrounds, to work with slow life history strategists, to work with kids that are good at inhibitory control and good at sustaining attention and good at sticking in one place. But we don't have to teach an algebra class that focuses on sustaining attention. You could redesign an algebra class to take advantage of shifting attention. There's some aspects of working memory that these kids from high-risk backgrounds are bad at. There's other aspects that they're good at, like rapid updating of working memory. So once we actually discover more about what are the skills that are enhanced as a result of developmental exposures to stress, then we would have the potential to leverage those skills in ways that would promote their success in education and employment and civic life more generally. So I think that, I'm becoming, I think there's two sides of the coin, and that both strategies, trying to change the kids, the traditional kind of intervention of trying to get them to be more like middle-class kids, is one strategy, but I think that there is another way forward as well.
Well, that's awesome. I'm gonna jump in before the others. I'm so eager to do so. But so let me just alter a few of the things that you said, because if we're really contextual, and instead of trying to get them to behave more like middle-class kids, we could say basically behave appropriately in a safe, secure environment. And so I'd reframe what you said is that the kids come to school, they're in unsafe mode, but actually you have provided a safe, secure environment in the school. And so the trick there is not to get them to behave like middle-class kids in all respects, but just to become more trusting in the school, which isn't the right thing to do. And moreover, I think that you could also make some objective statements, value statements, that if you could make the rest of their lives more safe and secure, that would be a good thing. So we're not being arbitrary in our value judgment that a safe and secure environment is better than an unsafe and an insecure environment. Now, on top of that, but what you wouldn't want them to do is to try to get them to be generically trusting and then put them in an unsafe environment. We call that declawing the cat in our paper. So these are just some thoughts, but the idea that there is some real mental assets to living in an unsafe. And by the way, the adult environment is highly unsafe and insecure. So I mean, these people from harsh environments really are pre-adapted to certain adult lives and occupations, so to realize strengths and what's called weaknesses. That's very great stuff. So I'm not opposing everything that you said by any means.
One of the things that kind of occurs to me as you talk about the interventions and we think about how to work with adolescents is often it seems like that's such an enormous problem. Young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, it seems like it's an enormous problem. How will we ever fix this problem? And I think that evolutionary perspectives, contextual behavioural science perspectives, and the interventions that you're talking about, Bruce and David and Joe, is you can see that small things, just for example, increasing trust, can make an enormous contextual change. And I think that's the way we need to start communicating the message. I work at the coalface with teachers and parents and professionals and they are often overwhelmed and think, how am I ever going to change this kid? They've got an insecure attachment, they've got an abusive environment, the school is aversive, this is just too big a problem. The contextual behavioural science and the evolutionary, and looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, you can actually see that small things can make incredible changes. And we know that if you look at people's histories, that they will often account for small changes that were the turning point. And I think our job is to get this message through to people who are trying to do things and becoming overwhelmed by the size of the problem.
Yeah.
And so I hope that chapters like this actually begin to get that message across, that it doesn't matter whether you do this intervention or this model or that model. What matters is from an evolutionary contextual behavioural science perspective, you can do many things and they don't need to necessarily cost a fortune or be dramatically different to the child's world.
Yeah.
Like from the outside, you don't need to physically take them out and transplant them into a different place.
Yes.
One idea with changing the context is Louise is working with me on this on helping disadvantaged kids to re-engage with education. And one of the biggest effects you can have is to make sure that young person has one adult mentor who commits to them, say, for 2 years and just supports them during that time. And just having that one person can kind of change the context enough that the kid becomes trusting, begins to see that something's possible, and that mentor acts as the context then. Yeah. So the context is us to some extent, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. We've gone an hour, but we can go a little more, and I really want to cover 2 more points, at least 2. And if you have some you want to add, please do. The first one is, and this is based on the work of other evolutionists, Rich Sosis and his student Candice Alcorda, who study religion and also traditional societies. And the point that they make is that in many traditional societies and in some modern religions, becoming an adult is very highly scripted. In the first place, there's not a lot of options. And in the second place, there are rituals that adolescents go through. And often these rituals are very dysphoric. They're harsh, they're often painful, even life-threatening. And what they do is they usher the person into the next stage of their life cycle, and that involves shedding, just not doing what you did before, and doing a whole bunch of new stuff, all scripted. So basically, people follow along this track with very few exceptions. So adolescence is not this time of uncertainty, this time of many options, this time where you have to elbow your way up a social hierarchy, all of these sorts of things, none of those. And you could even think of adolescent brain development and the fact that brain development does extend through adulthood, through adolescence, as a way to accommodate this. So I'm wondering if the modern adolescent social environment, with all its ambiguity and all of its lack of structure, is in fact a bit unusual. And that the ancestral situation, what the human brain is adapted for, is something which is much more scripted. What do you think of that?
Okay, I can go first. So from what you're describing is that in certain cultures, there are very distinct, rituals like puberty rites and puberty rituals or adolescent rituals where adolescents have to go through certain rites of passage. Now, even if those rites of passage are quite scripted in terms of what they are, they still involve challenges. It still involves sorting. So for instance, among the Ache, traditional, hunter-gatherer group in South America, about 25% of the males in each generation, never marry and apparently do not pass on their genes. So there are certainly, so among the Ache, there are, a relatively small number of quite successful males, usually the ones who are good hunters, first and foremost, or good fighters, who, may end up having, multiple offspring, have multiple wives, have a lot of sex partners, have a lot of offspring. Kim Hill and others have done the genetic analyses to show this. And then there are a certain number of males who just they're just not skillful enough. They just don't develop the hunting skills. They, and no amount of skill at basket weaving can compensate for, not being able to bring home game, for instance. And so this group where they just are not, passing on their genes to the next generation. And so there is sorting that occurs. And so that sorting, a lot of that sorting is going to happen in adolescence. And it may be linked to how they do in these rites of passage, how well they survive, how successful they are. They're going to be put on, it's going to affect their differential trajectories. So I would have to see data showing that adolescence had no impact to really be convinced that adolescence was not a time of sorting and status striving. To my understanding, cross-culturally, it very much is.
Good. Well, this is definitely an empirical question. Yeah. Well, my second point has to do with the experience that we're having with a prosocial, which is a method for making groups more efficacious of all kinds. So this is not restricted to adolescents. And the interesting point to make here is that when an individual wants to change, and even when you put them in an environment where they should change to adapt to the environment, change is still difficult. And it can be even more difficult with groups. So we all have ample experience with groups and groups changing in directions where they want to change. All sorts of stuff gets in the way. So it turns out that we have much of this conversation is based on the fact, change the context, and then individuals will adapt to that context, as if that process of adaptation is straightforward. But actually, it's not straightforward, or at least sometimes it's not straightforward. And even to change in the direction that everyone wants to change, we still require some kind of work. And I think that's one place where ACT comes in, is to accomplish that kind of work through things that are familiar to the ACT community, with the changing psychological flexibility, perspective taking, all of these sorts of things, working around obstacles. So it's like a managed process, and needs to be managed because our natural learning abilities, what we think of as operant conditioning and the overlay of symbolic thought and so on, often in true evolutionary style, just climbs a local peak and is not capable of traversing a multi-peak adaptive landscape. So I think there's another case in which the CBS piece comes in a very useful way that I've discovered. So that's just a plug for the CBS part of this.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we do with DNAV is that we totally agree. This won't be controversial at all to you, David, that the same processes that we use at the individual level, the same way of evaluating adaptation can be done at a group level. So we want groups to become more adaptive, more vital, as well as the individual. So I think you can scale this up to different levels.
Yeah.
As long as you accept group level selection.
Yeah, but I think one important thing to add when you think about adolescence is, and if you look at prosociality and how that is done with adults, is there's an assumption around valuing And I think that's why this vitality piece is actually really important, because, and as Bruce and Joe both said, is we need to think about the adolescent in context and to look at where they're getting their vitality. And a young person may be getting their vitality in a different way and not have that verbal piece developmentally developmentally in a way that you might use it with adults. I think there's a big difference. We need to think about the context and how they've been shaped to get what they need, and what they need is, which might not be your middle class. Your middle class. That's the tricky piece that we need to think about.
Right. Well, listen, please, yes.
Oh, yeah. So, David, you have a knack for asking the $64,000 questions. So you don't go for the small questions; you go for the really big questions. And what you just brought up is one of the big questions, and that is, to what extent are individuals going to be sensitive to context, or to what extent are they going to be resistant to that context? And as a developmental psychologist, we think a lot about I think a lot about developmental programming. Early life experiences get under the skin. Based on your early exposure to microbes, your immune system gets programmed. Based on your early exposure to threats and dangers, your stress physiology gets programmed. Your HPA axis gets programmed. Based on your early exposure to energetics, your metabolism gets programmed. And these things,
and that's overlaid upon genetic differences coming out of the box. So.
And that's overlaid on top, yes, and absolutely. And all that is overlaid on genetic differences coming out of the box. So all these things get under the skin. They all get epigenetically encoded, and so development has a lot of inertia. People often think, why aren't we just infinitely malleable? Why don't we just change perfectly with every situation? Well, the fact is we don't. People have personalities, and there's stability over time, and we bring, and that actually makes sense. The earlier that you start programming for a particular strategy, the better you tend to become at that strategy. So there's a lot of reasons, and you can't just calibrate your gonadal axis when you reach puberty. These things start prenatally, and so these things take time. So there's a lot of developmental inertia, but at the same time, there is, much sensitivity to context. Individuals have to read their context. They have to react to the environment that they're in. And so ultimately, understanding individual differences is going to be looking at an interaction between developmental experiences and current contexts. And I think, more and more what I'm seeing and what I'm engaging in are collaborations between, for instance, developmental psychologists and social psychologists, who are often doing kind of simple 2x2s that involve, variation in developmental experiences, and then often, variation in some kind of manipulated, environmental experience or induced psychological state, to showing, that early life experiences, what early life experiences are doing is they're often sensitizing you to react in different ways to current contexts. And you have to measure both and think about both to really answer that question as to what extent is your intervention or this environmental change going to be effective, and for whom?
Yeah, totally. And I do think that's something that the CBS folks can take on more than they have. An observation that I have is that there's there's a bit of the blank slate assumption, and it's even represented in a quote. I'm not accusing you two wonderful people of this, but there's a quote in your paper which says, naturally there's individual variation, but all young people are capable of developing their DNA skills. And there's a sense in which that's true and can be justified. And yet, I think in accord with what Bruce was saying, there might also be some added value in you might say even contextualizing the training.
The DNA skill are contextualized, David. So when we say DNA skill, that's only defined for each person according to what they need and their environment. So DNA, they're not skills that can be independent of how it's working in the context for that individual person, giving their history. So Louise and I spent a lot of time, for example, talking about trauma in the Thriving Adolescent in our chapter on self-compassion and how that changes people's noticer skill and shifts it. Maybe you want to talk a bit about this, Louise?
Well, think what we mean there in that quote, and I understand your point, if it seems decontextualized, but I think what we mean there is looking at the young person's behavior and stepping aside from the idea of looking at the form of the behavior and what it looks like from the outside, but looking at how it's functioning for the individual. So you can't decontextualize it. So it might look from a social perspective to be aversive, antisocial behavior, but functioning very well for the individual. And so when we talk about developing their DNA skills, we're looking about developing them in a way that helps them be more flexible for the environment that they're in.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think so. I think the context comes in when you actually go through the process. Like if it was the matrix, then it would come in when you're asking, what are the obstacles that get in the way? A lot of the context would get in, would come in there. Well, this has been awesome. Nothing but good can come from this kind of conversation, and I'm so happy to catalyze it basically with this book project. I also wanted to mention another common denominator, which is great science. On both sides, the whole mindset is very evidence-based, and so it's really the best of the behavioral sciences in terms of assessment and things like that. So there are facts of the matter that we need to consult. These are often do boil down to empirical issues, and isn't it nice to know that we're doing a very good job on that end of things.